This is about a financial disaster. It's kind of the sequel story to GameStop, but it didn't get quite as much ink, even though it's way scarier and more horrible. And it's about this dude, Bill Hwang, who was sanctioned years ago for market manipulation, insider trading, and he's nuts. And he has a hedge fund called Archegos. And Archegos, and people probably haven't heard this yet, basically this single individual just blew a hole in the economy that cost about $100 billion, maybe $200 billion. And we're not hearing about it because I think Wall Street's kind of embarrassed about how this happened, because it's not so much what he did, it's the underlying practices that allowed this to happen that are so scary. But I think the first thing you have to understand is that this guy, Bill Hwang, he's nuts. And
Wang nuts?
Yeah, so
nuts and Wang and nuts.
Matt, if we could see the clip of Bill Hwang, and it's at the 2-minute mark, you'll start to see where his particular investment philosophy comes into play.
나오면 굉장히 궁금해요. 이게 어떻게
How will this company enrich people's lives?
생활을 풍요롭게 할 것인가? 링크드인이라는 회사는
LinkedIn is a company that connects people to jobs that are a good fit for them, so that they can have good jobs.
찾아주는 거거든요. 하나님께서 그걸 좋아하시겠어요?
Do you think God would be pleased with it or not? Of course he would be pleased.
예수님께서 행하신 거하고 똑같아요.
It's just like what Jesus did. Jesus was sent to this world by God.
이 땅에 왔고
And he said, I have come to do the work of my Father, and he did it well. He was gentle and loving in his ministry, that's culture. And finally, he invested in a lot of people and helped them grow. So ultimately, I try to invest with those principles.
And you know where God and Jesus met?
Where?
LinkedIn.
That's right. Otherwise, they just never would have made that connection, right?
Right.
So later on, he in that video he made a couple of years ago for this charity, he says that he invests without fear of death or money, and that he has freedom that makes people on Wall Street wonder. What he did is he went to every big bank on Wall Street, and he decided to place these massive bets on 9 different companies. So let's just say that he bet $1 million on Viacom CBS, which is one of the companies. So he would go to Goldman Sachs and he'd say, I want to bet, here's $1 million, but I want you to lend me another 9 times that or 7 times that so I can bet on Viacom. So he would put a small amount of collateral, and then the banks would lend him like multiple times that to buy shares in these companies. And in doing so, he ended up accumulating as much as 30% ownership in 9 enormous companies on Wall Street, which single-handedly sent the share prices of these companies skyrocketing. And the punchline to all of this is that each of the banks thought they were the only ones doing this. But then they discovered at the end of March that they were all doing this. So that they had all lent him this one guy, this massive amount of money, and that was single-handedly pushing the stock market way up because he was, and he never actually posted the collateral himself. So this was all money that he borrowed from the banks to just basically to shoot Viacom from $30-something to $100. So if you remember all the consternation about GameStop, because GameStop went from whatever it was, $6 to $347, right? But people thought that was funny because that was like ordinary people doing it.
Right.
Right? It was people on Reddit who had decided, hey, let's just bet up this stock and see if we can mess with some hedge funds who are betting against it. And so they did that. This is the same thing, except it's not ordinary people on Reddit doing it. It's like one crazy SEC sanctioned Jesus freak market manipulator.
Right.
And he managed somehow to hoodwink all the biggest banks on Wall Street into doing this one deal, and they all took massive losses. Credit Suisse just announced like a $5.5 billion loss. So this is like it's one of the biggest stories of this type since Bernie Madoff, but it's much bigger than Bernie Madoff. And they're being kind of quiet about it because no one knows if there are more things like that out there.
Right.
And if there are, the stock market's been going up, obviously. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that there's just way too much money in the system. Since the bailouts of last year and this year, the Fed is just kind of pumping all this liquidity into the market. And that's allowing the banks to do this kind of thing. So this looks like it looks like a hint that there is a kind of a massive problem with overvaluing stuff in the markets. If and when we have, a correction or a stock market crash, they'll probably look back at this and say this was a warning that wasn't really followed up.
Right.
On. So, and the Goldman penis envy thing. Yeah, when I talked about this, one of the reasons this happens is because banks that aren't Goldman Sachs, when they get somebody who's crazy walking through their door saying, hey, you know what? I'd like to bet like $1 gazillion on this company and I don't really have a whole lot of money, but can you lend me, ass loads of money so that I can make this a responsible bet? They'll all do it because they desperately want to be Goldman or Morgan Stanley. So they outdo each other in terms of how much money they'll lend to somebody like this.
Right.
And I had somebody describe that as as Goldman penis envy. And so they're all doing this because they want to be at the top of the market. But the result is you get these crazy situations.
Yeah.
In all seriousness, this is a big story. This is like, I mean, the GameStop thing kind of woke people up to the idea that the markets are kind of fictitious and there are these wild swings in prices that are happening because suddenly there are all kinds of actors who are involved in the market who were never involved before.
Right.
This is different and way worse because it suggests that basically anybody can walk through the door of a major bank and what they're basically letting them do is max out a dozen charge cards to bet on the stock market. And so you see the stock market going up. The question we have to now ask is how much of that is people just maxing out their charge cards to bet on the market? It could be a lot, and eventually they're going to have to pay their bills and, it's a scary story.
But I have a question. Was this different? Like with Madoff like ruined the lives of a lot of regular people, right? I mean, regular wealthy people. So does this type of stuff happen?
Sure. It's this in this case, anybody who bet on who bought at those. Right. Let's say you bought Viacom at 80 when it was going up to, it was on its way up to 100 because of this guy. And let's say you bought a whole bunch of that stock at 80. By the time this whole thing came out, the stock went down to 40. So that's when they're talking about how there's the banks by themselves lost $10 billion. So just the people who were buying securities for him lost $10 billion. But the other people who were invested in those stocks have what the estimate now is that they've lost between $100 and $200 billion.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
So and stocks related to those stocks. So there's lots and lots of people who've lost tons of money because of this. In fact it's worse than the Madoff thing because the Madoff thing was fairly confined to people who were invested with him. Right. But that's not the case here.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, why doesn't he ask himself, what would Jesus do? WWJD and like give them back the money?
Because he doesn't have any. That's the punchline of the whole thing is that.
Right.
So there are all these news stories, and it's funny. The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the New York Post, they're all talking about how he has a personal net worth of up to $50 billion, but there's never been any evidence that he actually has any money. So this is, again, that's similar to the Madoff thing. When they actually looked into the guy's books, they found that he had never made a trade, didn't have any cash. Not any cash. He had some, but not nearly what he was representing. But the systemic weakness here is that anybody who's invested in the stock market probably should be wondering, like, how much more of this bullshit is out there, and like, am I going to get hit by this too? And